In the heart of Constantinople, where golden domes gleamed under the sun and every shadow whispered betrayal, a woman was born who would defy the rules of her world. Her name was Irene, and while history often remembers her as the Empress who sentenced her lovers to death after a single night of passion, her story doesn't begin with power or crowns. No. It begins in the shadows, eyes wide open, lips tightly sealed. She was known as Irene of Athens before the empire reshaped her. Born around 752 into a noble family, she had no direct ties to the throne. But from a young age, whispers about her beauty floated through the elite circles of Byzantium. Still, her most dangerous gift wasn't her face, it was her mind. Sharp, quiet, observant. She moved like someone who understood that in Byzantium, every word could be turned against you. At that time, the Byzantine Empire was under the rule of Emperor Constantine V, a man as committed to iconoclasm, the destruction of religious images, as he was ruthless toward his enemies. It was in his court that Irene first displayed a chilling skill, seducing without speaking, advancing without moving. To survive in Constantinople's lethal court politics was a feat. But Irene didn't just survive, she flourished. Everything changed when she was around 16. Constantine's son, the young Emperor Leo IV, needed a wife. But not just any wife. One who was noble enough for the throne, beautiful enough for public adoration, and most importantly, politically harmless. Someone who seemed docile. From hundreds of candidates, Irene was chosen. And no one suspected that the future of the empire was being handed to a girl with a mind like a blade. When Irene first arrived at the palace, she barely spoke. She walked with her eyes fixed on the marble floors, her posture timid and unthreatening. But inside, she was watching, memorizing every corridor, every face, every eavesdropping eunuch. In this world, she knew, silence wasn't weakness, it was power. She married Leo IV in 769, and many assumed she would fade into the background, just another pretty face by the emperor's side. But Irene had no intention of being ornamental. From the very first night beside Leo, she made a silent vow. If she wanted to survive, she couldn't just be his wife. She had to become his equal, or better yet, his master. Her rise was almost invisible at first. While Leo busied himself with military and religious matters, Irene moved behind the scenes. Not with generals or bishops. That would be too obvious. She formed alliances with those who truly ran the palace. Eunuchs, concubines, servants who lingered behind curtains and in candlelit halls. Irene understood something essential. In Byzantium, secrets were more valuable than swords. Then came the moment that sealed her destiny: pregnancy. She was carrying the future emperor. Suddenly, she wasn't just the wife. She was the mother of the heir. And in Byzantium, that meant one foot already rested on the throne. Leo IV, meanwhile, was a weak ruler, sickly, unsure of himself, surrounded by enemies. Irene stood behind him in public, supportive and serene. But in private, she began to manipulate everything. She filtered who could see him, who could speak to him, and what he heard. In just a few short years, the gentle Irene had become the invisible master of the imperial court. Then, in 780, Leo died, officially of a fever, though many whispered poison. Irene acted swiftly. Their son, Constantine VI, was just 9 years old, too young to rule. So she took the reins as regent. The woman once chosen for her apparent meekness now sat alone on the throne. But ruling Byzantium was not for the faint-hearted. Irene's enemies gathered quickly. Generals who couldn't stand taking orders from a woman. Clergy who saw her as a threat to religious orthodoxy. Nobles who thought she had no right to rule. And so, Irene stopped smiling. If anyone wanted to take her power, they'd have to pry it from her cold, dead hands. And so began her reign, fingers tight around the scepter, eyes wide open. A reign that would become legendary, not just for her cunning and beauty, but for her ruthlessness. Because once Irene tasted power, she discovered another hunger, pleasure. But not just any pleasure, the pleasure of control. The kind that left no trace. When a man shared her bed, he might think he had won her favor. But the truth would always come for him. Irene had learned one of power's cruelest lessons. The body could be a weapon, and desire was a battlefield. She was no longer just a regent. She was the most powerful woman in the empire. And in that position, loneliness became her shadow. No one dared to love her. No one could touch her without permission. But that didn't mean she couldn't enjoy herself on her terms. In public, she was flawless, firm, pious, the guardian of her young emperor's son. But within the palace walls, whispered rumors began to take shape. Unsettling truths passed between trembling lips. The men who shared Irene's bed never seemed to last. It didn't happen instantly. Some vanished weeks later, others were gone by morning. But soon, a pattern emerged. One too precise to be coincidence. None of Irene's lovers survived for long. Some were sent into exile on false charges. Some turned up dead, and some simply disappeared, like smoke in the night. Musicians, soldiers, artists, all handsome, all charismatic, all gone. Irene chose them with a blend of calculation and whim. She didn't need love. She didn't want comfort. What she craved was power, the intoxicating feeling of holding another's fate in her hands. Why did she have them killed? Was it fear? Paranoia? A desire to keep secrets buried? Maybe. But there was something deeper, something darker. Control. After a night of passion, the man was always left exposed, vulnerable. He believed he'd touched the heart of an empress, only for her to tear out the illusion before it could bloom. It was punishment, a preventative strike. In a world where being a woman and an empress was rebellion enough, Irene allowed no weakness. Anyone who dared touch her had to pay the price of coming too close to fire. And the most terrifying part? It was never messy, never loud. No blood, no screams. Death obeyed her quietly. One of the most infamous examples was Alexios, a young Armenian soldier mysteriously promoted after a religious ceremony. For weeks he was seen at Irene's side. People whispered that maybe, just maybe, she had found a favorite, a consort, a lasting lover. Then, one night after a banquet at the Hippodrome, Irene requested wine be brought to her chamber. Alexios went. He never came out. By morning, his name had vanished from palace records. His belongings were confiscated. His family was exiled. A servant who dared to ask what happened was sentenced to the salt mines in Crimea. That was how Irene's circle of pleasure and death worked. Precise, seductive, ruthless, and traceless. Yet publicly, she remained untouchable. A model empress. She spearheaded religious reforms, presided over the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, and restored the veneration of sacred icons, a move that arguably saved Orthodox Christianity from collapse. She was a figure of devotion and a deadly mystery. But behind the curtain, something darker stirred. Her own son, Constantine VI, was growing older. And with each passing year, He became less a boy and more a threat. Constantine VI was no longer a child. He was the legitimate heir, born to rule, and he knew it. The regency of his mother, once necessary, now felt like a chain, and so he began to push back. He questioned her decisions, demanded a say in matters of state, sought allies among the military and nobility. The boy who had once been a symbol in his mother's hands now wanted to wield power for himself. But Irene had crushed lovers for less. What would she do with a son who wanted to dethrone her? The pattern was clear. Pleasure was met with execution, boldness with erasure, betrayal with fire. But this threat came not from the bedchamber, it came from her blood. The story of Constantine VI is one of the empire's bitterest tragedies. Though crowned by the will of his father, Leo IV, the reality was he had never truly ruled. From the moment Leo died, Irene had gripped the reins of power, and Constantine had grown up in the shadow of a mother who knew no limits, who ruled with iron wrapped in silk. For years, she kept him at a distance from the heart of power. She dressed him up for public ceremonies, presented him as the sacred son of the empire, but surrounded him with eunuchs, spies, and sycophants loyal only to her. In name, he was emperor. But in truth, Irene wore the crown in her soul. As he reached 16, Constantine's ambitions ignited. He demanded to sign decrees, to lead Senate meetings, to command armies. Irene pretended to allow it. She gave him tokens of power, but she never took her eyes off him. Every word, every gesture, every order, all monitored. He didn't realize it, but he was already on trial. Soon, their conflict spilled into the open. Constantine wanted to reform the army, hunt freely, strip his mother of her control. Rumors of plots buzzed around the palace. A few generals backed him, hoping for a strong, male emperor. But they forgot who Irene was. She wasn't just a woman. She was the woman who had outlived emperors, slit the throat of court traditions, and buried anyone who dared challenge her rule. In 797, the pressure reached its peak. Irene, who had once spared rivals and forgiven insults, decided her son could not be allowed to rise further. She was not just a mother. She was the emperor, and the empire came first. One summer night, under the moonless sky, Irene gave the order. Soldiers from the imperial guard burst into Constantine's chambers. It happened fast. No struggle, only shock. The rightful heir of Byzantium seized on the command of his own mother. He was taken to a chamber in the palace, a chamber where emperors had once been crowned. But there would be no coronation that night. Irene didn't sentence him to death. Perhaps she still held a fragment of affection, or maybe she needed to maintain appearances. But what she did was worse. She ordered him blinded. In Byzantium, a blinded emperor was as good as dead. He could not rule. It was political execution, clean, bloodless, final. The operation was brutal. Chroniclers wrote that Constantine screamed for hours, that the surgeons paused twice, overwhelmed by his agony, that Irene heard the cries from her quarters and didn't blink. Afterward, he vanished. Some said he died from infection. Others claimed he lived for years, locked in a dark room within the palace, tended to by silent servants, never seeing daylight again. But the result was the same. Irene had removed the last obstacle. And then she did the unthinkable. She crowned herself emperor, not empress, emperor. For the first time in Byzantine history, a woman ruled alone, not as regent, not as consort, but as sovereign. She took the masculine title Basileus and had it engraved on coins, decrees, and state documents. She ruled without a co-emperor. The throne belonged to her and her alone. It was a political earthquake. In Rome, Pope Leo III refused to acknowledge her legitimacy. He claimed the throne of the empire was empty, because in his words, a woman could not be emperor. And so, in an act that would change the course of Western history, the Pope crowned Charlemagne king of the Franks as emperor of the West. Irene, unknowingly, had triggered a geopolitical fracture. East and West, Byzantium and Rome, were now rivals, each with its own emperor. But Irene didn't flinch. As the Christian world split in two, she kept her grip on power, ruling with the same fire that had taken her from the shadows of Athens to the golden halls of Constantinople. She had it all: the empire, the throne, and no one, not a lover, not a son, in her bed or blood to take it from her. For years, she reigned alone, an anomaly in the chronicles of Byzantium. Not a queen beside a king, not a temporary ruler, a sovereign. The imperial court marched to her will. Her name adorned coinage. Her word was law. But behind the majesty, something darker was brewing. Power, once seized, demands constant sacrifice, and when the blood stops flowing, the throne begins to shake. Toward the end of her reign, cracks appeared. The military elite felt sidelined. Younger bureaucrats, raised to fear her, began to question whether a woman who had blinded her own son could still protect the empire. And worse, the treasury was nearly empty. The gold had been drained by costly wars, bribes to secure alliances, and grand reforms designed to mask instability. Irene wasn't blind to the rumors. She tightened her court, surrounded herself with loyal eunuchs, exiled threatening generals, and dissolved dangerous marriage alliances. She bought silence with land and titles, but the walls were closing in. The borders of the empire came under attack. Bulgarians and Arabs raided towns. Soldiers weren't paid on time. Whispers of rebellion grew louder in the marble halls of Constantinople. The breaking point didn't come from outside. It came from within. A young, brilliant bureaucrat named Nikephoros began rising through the ranks. He had no ties to Irene's past, no debts to her. But he knew how to play the Byzantine game, a game of blood, patience, and masks. Irene, proud and aging, didn't see the threat. Or perhaps she did, but was too tired for another purge. She was over 50, an advanced age in that era. Her body was weakening, but her mind remained razor-sharp. In the final months, the empire grew quiet. Fewer public appearances, fewer proclamations. It was as if the palace itself was holding its breath. Then, in October of 802, it happened. Before dawn, soldiers loyal to Nikephoros entered the palace. There was no resistance, no outcry, no final stand. Irene was found sitting alone in the throne room, as if she had been waiting for the end. When told she was deposed, she didn't beg, she didn't weep. She simply asked, "Has the people said anything?" There was no answer. No riots, no protests, no mourning. The woman who had ruled an empire with fire and desire was led away, down the same corridors that once trembled under her command. She was exiled to the island of Lesbos, a gilded prison, alive but stripped of everything. No lovers, no family, no throne. On Lesbos, Irene lived out her final days in silence. She spent her time weaving, praying, and writing letters that were never answered. The woman who had once held the world in her hands was now just a shadow, her power reduced to memories and prayers whispered into the wind. But the most chilling part of her fall wasn't the exile itself. It was how completely she was erased. Those who had once praised her now pretended she'd never existed. Her portraits were taken down, her laws repealed, her name scrubbed from coins. The empire didn't just dethrone her, it tried to bury her memory. Only a handful of chroniclers dared to write the truth, that for over 20 years, a woman had ruled Byzantium with a force and authority no man could match. She manipulated, she seduced, she commanded, and she killed, with the same ease that others signed decrees. Her story wasn't just about blood, it was a warning. Irene's exile wasn't only physical, it was a methodical effort to erase her legacy. Loyalists to Nikephoros avoided even mentioning her name. Coins that bore her face were melted down. Administrative reforms she had implemented, reforms that had once stabilized the empire, were swiftly dismantled. It was as if the empire wanted to pretend that a woman had never worn the crown. But history has a memory longer than any throne. Irene wasn't just a regent. She was a strategist, a ruler without a king, an outlier who broke the unwritten rules of a world built for and by men. What frightened her successors wasn't just her cruelty, many emperors had been just as brutal, but that she ruled as an equal, or worse, as a superior, and that she did it alone. She was accused of ambition, of manipulation, of murdering her own child, and all of it was true. But what was also true was that she kept the empire together in a time of crisis. She reformed the administration, modernized taxation, and brought the fractured empire back under centralized rule. Even her enemies admitted it, though only behind closed doors. The price she paid was immense. The deaths of her lovers, that scandalous detail often used to define her, weren't simply acts of cruelty. They were brutal, effective strategies to avoid dangerous alliances. In Byzantium, intimacy could be a political weapon. Every lover had the potential to become a traitor. Every night of passion, a future betrayal. Irene knew that, and she struck first. It wasn't her violence that made her exceptional. It was the way she used it. Her control over pleasure and power made her an anomaly. She wasn't a pawn in the game of court intrigue. She was the player, the one pulling the strings. Years after her death, her name resurfaced in hidden texts, private letters, and monastery scrolls. Some cursed her, others praised her in whispers, but all remembered her. No other woman in Byzantine history would ever hold the kind of absolute power Irene once wielded. Not even the great empresses of the 10th century, like Zoe or Theodora, ruled without sharing the throne. In the 15th century, during the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered her name in forgotten manuscripts. Irene was reborn, not as a villain, but as a symbol. To some, she became a martyr of patriarchy. To others, a prototype of Machiavellian genius. Her life became the archetype of a woman who, in a world that demanded submission, chose domination. But the question that still lingers isn't whether Irene was good or evil. It's whether she was necessary. Can a woman rise to absolute power without being brutal? Can she survive an empire without using the same weapons men have always wielded? Irene didn't try to change the system. She mastered it, bent it to her will, and in doing so forced the world to confront its own reflection. Byzantium wasn't ready for her. That's why when she fell, no one came to her defense. Because as long as her memory survived, so did the terrifying idea that another woman could rise just like her. They couldn't risk that. In exile, some say Irene would stare at the sea for hours, murmuring prayers, not as repentance, but to stay sharp. They say she never cried, never asked for forgiveness, never expressed regret. As if she knew that, no matter how history judged her, it would never forget her. Because history has a second face, quieter, slower, but just as powerful. Collective memory. And in that memory, Irene left a mark that no emperor, no propaganda, no passage of time could fully erase. Over the centuries, Irene returned, like a ghost draped in imperial robes, to haunt the corridors of power, to inspire, to warn, depending on who looked. Her name, once silenced by emperors and priests, now gleams in academic studies, historical novels, feminist essays, and even modern-day series and games, seeking to reclaim the women who once shook the world without permission. But what does Irene really represent today? To some, she's the ultimate femme fatale of politics, using beauty, desire, and cunning to seize control, even at the cost of her own son. It's no surprise she appears in leadership studies as an example of total, unapologetic female power in a world ruled by men. What still unsettles many isn't her ambition, it's her methods. Because had a man done what she did, and many did, history would have praised him as decisive, iron-willed. Others see her as the forerunner of the modern woman, one who refuses to be what is expected of her. Not a decorative wife, not a self-sacrificing mother. Irene ruled alone, spoke with her own voice, chose and discarded lovers, defied the church, and used the throne as a personal fortress. She wasn't a feminist in the modern sense, but her life has become a symbol of a woman's right to power without apology. She also mirrors one of patriarchy's oldest fears. What happens when a woman no longer needs protection, but becomes the protector and the executioner? In many cultures, powerful empresses are cast as dangerous anomalies. Irene fits that mold with eerie precision. The queen who didn't just rule, but killed to keep ruling. The woman who used pleasure to control, not to please. In contemporary art, she is often painted as a majestic, shadowy figure, wrapped in imperial robes, surrounded by the ghosts of fallen lovers, her golden crown stained with blood. But also, as the woman who looked an empire in the eyes and said, "I can do this too." And she did. Writers have reinvented her story again and again, as Greek tragedy, as political thriller. Some versions paint her as a victim, driven to cruelty by betrayal. Others depict her as a dark goddess who chose power above all else. But all agree on one thing: Irene cannot be ignored. Even in academic debates about leadership, she's a fascinating case. Is it ethical to destroy your enemies to preserve the state? Does gender affect how we judge authority? Why do we still discuss Irene with such intensity, while so many male emperors have been forgotten? Because Irene doesn't fit into a box. Not saint, not witch, not martyr, not monster, just Irene. Her story still resonates today, especially in conversations about how women wield power. She used her beauty, yes, but as a means, not an end. Her bed wasn't a retreat, it was a battlefield. A night with her could mean ecstasy or the end, and that, to the male-dominated world, was terrifying. So what does Irene's story teach us now? That she never really vanished. She lives on in every woman who refuses to ask for permission, in every leader who's called cold, calculating, or dangerous for simply being strong. What unsettled people about Irene wasn't her cruelty. Irene of Athens, Irene of Byzantium, she didn't just wear a crown. She redefined what it meant to do so. And though she died alone, with no funeral, no mourning crowd, no artist painting her final moments, she left behind something far more powerful than legacy. She left behind a question. What are we willing to allow when power wears the face of a woman? History often makes simple judgments. It glorifies winners, punishes outliers. But Irene refuses to be simplified. She was a mother, a lover, a sovereign, a strategist, a visionary, and, eventually, a prisoner. She never fit one mold. And maybe that's what makes her so haunting, so unforgettable. Because in the end, Irene wasn't just the empress who killed her lovers. She was the woman who ruled an empire alone and made the world tremble, not with her smile, but with her will. And long after the thrones were dust, the coins melted, and the scrolls faded, her name, Irene, still cuts through history like a blade, not as a ghost, as a memory that refuses to die.